The wine hit her like a verdict. Cold, red, deliberate. It spread across the ivory silk of the designer gown in slow motion, the kind of slow motion that your brain forces upon moments too painful to process at normal speed. And the room went quiet in that particular way that crowds go quiet when they smell blood. Not the respectful silence of sympathy, the hungry silence of spectacle. She stood there in the middle of Seoul's most exclusive ballroom, surrounded by crystal chandeliers worth more than her entire year's tuition, surrounded by people in outfits that cost more than her mother's house back in Lagos, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, completely alone. Her hands were trembling. She could feel the wet fabric clinging to her stomach, the wine trickling down toward the floor in a thin red line, like something bleeding out. She didn't cry. Not immediately. She was too shocked to cry. Her eyes moved across the room, past the cameras that guests had already raised, past the whispers being passed from mouth to mouth like poison, past the security guards cutting through the crowd toward her with their earpieces and their stone expressions, until they landed on her cousin. Adaeze, standing a few feet away, wine glass still half raised, wearing an expression she was trying very hard to sculpt into something that looked like shock. But it wasn't shock. It wasn't even close to shock. It was satisfaction. Barely hidden, barely controlled. The satisfaction of someone watching a plan they built with their own hands finally arrive at its destination. What Adaeze did not know, what none of them knew in that suspended, terrible moment, was that somewhere across that ballroom, a man was watching. Not with the hungry curiosity of the other guests. Not with their rehearsed disgust or their performative outrage. He was watching with the quiet, calculating stillness of someone who had spent 20 years reading rooms, reading people, reading the spaces between what was being said and what was actually happening. Park Jiwon, CEO of PJ Holdings, one of the most powerful corporate entities in South Korea. The man who had personally sponsored this charity gala. The man whose name was on the banner above the entrance. The man who had, in 3 decades of business, never once acted impulsively. Never once reacted before he understood. He was watching Adaeze's face, and something about it was deeply, deeply wrong. In his 47 years, Park Jiwon had attended enough performances to recognize one. And what he was watching right now, this woman with her barely concealed satisfaction, these friends with their 2 perfectly timed reactions, this security team that arrived almost too quickly, this was not a woman discovering that someone had stolen her dress. This was a curtain call. Someone had rehearsed this, and the girl standing in the middle of the room, humiliated and trembling, wine soaking through silk that wasn't even hers. She had no idea she'd walked into a theater. But before we tell you what happened next, before we take you inside the investigation that would shake Seoul's elite social world to its foundation and expose a scandal far darker than a stolen dress, you need to understand who she was. You need to understand how she got there. Because this story doesn't begin at a gala. It begins in a tiny apartment in Mapogu, at 2 in the morning, with a girl scrubbing floors she didn't dirty so she could pay rent on a room she barely slept in. Before we go any further, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your country in the comments because people are tuning in from all over the world for this one, and I want to see you down there. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it right now. Because what is about to unfold in this story goes so much deeper than public humiliation. The truth behind what happened at that gala is darker, more calculated, and more shocking than anything you're expecting. There is a financial scandal buried inside this story that reaches into some of Seoul's most powerful families. And the ending? The ending is going to leave you completely speechless. Like the video, stay with me. Let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Chisom, 24 years old. Environmental science student at one of Seoul's mid-tier universities, here on a partial academic scholarship that covered tuition but nothing else. Not rent, not food, not the bus fare it took to get from her apartment to campus every morning. She had come to Korea 3 years ago with 2 suitcases, a worn Bible her grandmother had pressed into her hands at the airport, and the kind of hope that only people who have never had anything can carry without breaking under the weight of it. Korea had not been kind to her in the ways she had imagined. She had imagined libraries and laboratories, late-night study sessions with friends, maybe even the beginning of a real career. What she found instead was a kind of quiet, grinding survival that aged her in small, invisible ways. She worked 3 jobs. Not 2. 3. From Monday through Friday, she cleaned office buildings in Uedo from 11 at night until 3 in the morning, pushing a mop through glass-walled corridors where financial analysts made in 1 hour what she made in a month. On weekends, she worked a lunch shift at a small Nigerian restaurant in Itaewon run by a kind older woman from Anambra who sometimes sent her home with leftover jollof rice and a look in her eyes that said, "I see you, my daughter. I see what this is costing you." And in the tiny pockets of time left over, Tuesday afternoons, Sunday evenings, she tutored other international students in English, charging rates so modest they almost felt like charity. Every month she sent money home. Not all of it. She wasn't reckless. But enough. Enough to help her mother with the electricity bills that kept getting cut. Enough to pay her younger brother's secondary school fees. Enough to keep the quiet promise she had made to herself on the plane to Seoul, that she would not come back empty-handed, that this sacrifice would mean something, that the people she loved would feel it even from this distance. She ate mostly ramen. Not because she liked it, but because it was cheap and filling and required no thought. She wore the same 4 or 5 outfits in rotation, washed carefully by hand in her small bathroom sink because the laundromat down the street cost money she didn't have. She had long since abandoned the idea of a social life, the going-out money, the coffee shop money, the cinema money, the simple, ordinary money of being young didn't exist in her budget. She studied when she wasn't working, and when she wasn't studying, she was sleeping the short, heavy sleep of someone who had used every last reserve. And yet, people who encountered Chisom, really encountered her, not just passed her in a corridor, always remarked on the same thing. There was a softness to her that her circumstances had not managed to strip away. A gentleness that lived in the way she spoke, unhurried and careful, choosing words the way someone who understood their weight would. A warmth that surfaced even in brief exchanges, with the security guard at her building who she always greeted by name, with the elderly woman at the bus stop she once spent 15 minutes helping find her stop even when she was already running late. She was lonely in the deep, structural way that international students living in poverty are lonely, not just without friends, but without the ordinary scaffolding of belonging that most people never notice until it's gone. She didn't talk about it. Not to her mother, who had enough to carry. Not to anyone. She just moved through her life in Seoul quietly, carefully, like someone trying not to take up too much space in a world that kept reminding her she didn't quite fit. She had dreams. She still had them, folded away like old letters, the research position she used to imagine, the fieldwork in environmental policy, the version of herself that might one day walk into a room not as someone who cleaned it but as someone who belonged in it. She kept those dreams alive the way you keep a small flame alive in wind. Cupped in your hands, bent over it, protecting it from everything. She just didn't know that the biggest threat to everything she had protected was about to arrive wearing the face of family. Adaeze was everything Chisom was not, and she had never forgiven Chisom for the things Chisom was that she couldn't touch. On the surface, Adaeze had won. That much was undeniable. She had married Kwon Sung-go, heir to a mid-sized Korean real estate conglomerate with significant ties to hospitality and private investment. At 26, in a ceremony that cost more than most Nigerian weddings even dare to imagine. She lived in a 4-bedroom apartment in Gangnam, wore designer labels with the fluency of someone born into them, attended charity galas and gallery openings and private dinners where the table settings alone were works of art. Her friends were a tight, gleaming circle of women who had all married or inherited their way into Seoul's upper social tier, Korean, expat, and a handful of other African women who had made the strategic transition from outsider to insider with the single-minded focus of chess players. They lunched at restaurants with no menus, only tasting courses. They traveled to Jeju and Bali and Santorini and posted photographs that people saved to their phones and stared at in the small, envious hours of the night. From the outside, Adaeze was triumphant. From the inside, she was rotting with something she could not name out loud and so named it everything else. Ambition, taste, standards, discernment. But what it really was, stripped of all its expensive clothing, was jealousy. Old jealousy. The kind that starts in childhood and grows alongside you, fed by 100 small moments. A teacher's approval, a relative's compliment. A cousin who walked into every room with a quiet grace that couldn't be bought and so could never be outcompete. Chisom had always been the one people noticed. Not for wealth, she had none. Not for status, she had none of that either. But for something more infuriating and harder to dismiss. A quality of presence and authenticity, a genuineness that Adaeze had spent years and a great deal of money trying to manufacture and still couldn't quite get right. And there was something else. Something Adaeze's polished friends didn't fully know. Something buried under the designer labels and the charity event circuit. The Kwan family's finances were not as solid as their social image suggested. There were gaps. Internal gaps that Sungo had been quietly, desperately trying to paper over for 2 years. Missing funds from a subsidiary investment account. Irregularities in a real estate development deal that had attracted the attention of a financial oversight committee. Nothing had gone public yet, but the pressure was building, and Adaeze, who knew more than she pretended to, who had in fact helped direct some of those redirected funds into accounts only she could access, was watching the walls close in with increasing panic beneath her perfectly maintained exterior. She needed a distraction. She needed a story. And when her group chat with her 3 closest friends began spinning the idea of bringing Chisom into a public space and dismantling her there, publicly, spectacularly, in a way that would generate social media coverage and dominate conversation, Adaeze had felt the panic in her chest loosen just slightly. A scandal about a Nigerian girl stealing a dress would be so much easier to talk about than a scandal about embezzled corporate funds. She had started making plans the same evening. The phone call came on a Thursday evening. Chisom was on her hands and knees in the corridor of an office building in Uedo, cleaning the baseboards with a small brush because the regular mop didn't reach, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She almost ignored it. Then she saw the name on the screen. Adaeze. She sat back on her heels and stared at it for a moment. They hadn't spoken in almost 8 months. Before that, the gaps between conversations had been growing steadily wider. A missed birthday message, an unanswered voice note, the gradual geographic and emotional distance that wealth creates between people who were once close. Chisom had told herself she didn't mind. She had her own life. She had survived worse absences. But she answered, because she was human, and loneliness makes humans answer calls they might otherwise let ring out. Adaeze's voice was warm, warmer than Chisom remembered. She asked about university, about health, about Chisom's mother back in Enugu with a specificity that suggested she'd recently reviewed the details she'd let slide for months. And then, gently, almost shyly, which should have been the first sign because Adaeze was never shy, she mentioned the Gala. PJ Holdings' annual charity gala. One of the most prestigious events in Seoul's social calendar. Celebrities, CEOs, international investors, philanthropists. A genuine luxury event with a genuine charitable purpose, which Adaeze described in enough detail to make it sound like an opportunity rather than a trap. "I'd love for you to come," she said. "You work so hard, Chisom. You never get to experience anything beautiful. Come. Be my guest." Chisom hesitated. The hesitation was not pride. She was past the point of protecting herself from charity. The hesitation was practical. She had nothing to wear to something like that. Nothing that wouldn't mark her immediately as someone who didn't belong there, which was, she said carefully, probably the truth. "I have something for you," Adaeze said, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "A dress I bought for an event and never wore. Ivory silk. It will be perfect on you. I'll send it over." And here is the moment that everything hinges on. Here is the moment that, looking back, Chisom would replay in the months to come with a kind of tender, aching sadness. Not for what it cost her, but for what she had felt in it. When that dress arrived, wrapped in tissue and delivered by a driver she didn't recognize, and she held it up in her small apartment and saw the label and understood the price and felt the weight of the fabric in her hands. She had felt, for the first time in a very long time, seen. Not pitted. Seen. Like maybe the cousin who had drifted away had finally looked back and noticed what she was carrying, and had reached out her hand. She hadn't been to anything beautiful in 3 years. She said yes. What she didn't know. What she couldn't have known, because it was happening in a group chat she wasn't part of. On phones she'd never seen, between women whose laughter she would have recognized if she'd been able to hear it, was that the dress had already been photographed. Its tags had been carefully preserved and sealed back so they appeared untouched. Adaeze had already told the security team's coordinator that she would be reporting a missing item during the event. Her friend Minji had already positioned herself near the event photographer with specific instructions about which angles to capture. Another friend, Yoonji, had already drafted the social media captions, 3 versions, depending on how dramatic the moment became. Their plan was not impulsive. It was designed. Each step had been considered, each reaction choreographed. They weren't going to just embarrass Chisom. They were going to make her unwatchable. They were going to make her the story that Seoul's social media talked about for weeks. The Nigerian girl who crashed a luxury gala in a stolen dress, who didn't know her place, who thought she could belong somewhere she had no business being. And then, under the cover of that story's noise, the whispers about missing funds and financial irregularities would quiet down, buried under something more colorful, more clickable, more cruel. They were so certain it would work. They had no idea who was going to be watching. The ballroom of the Grand Sirac Hotel was the kind of space designed to make ordinary people feel small. 3 stories of soaring glass and steel, draped in pale gold light from chandeliers that cascaded like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling. Round tables dressed in white linen and centerpieces of white orchids. A string quartet playing somewhere near the entrance. Waiters moving through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of professionals, carrying trays of champagne flutes and canapes that Chisom couldn't identify and didn't dare take. She stood at the entrance for a moment before stepping fully inside, and she breathed. The dress was extraordinary. She had not fully understood that until she put it on in her apartment earlier that evening, in the bathroom mirror that was slightly too small to see her whole reflection. But she'd seen enough. The ivory silk moved with her like water. The cut was simple but precise in the way that only very expensive simplicity is. She'd borrowed a pair of low gold heels from a classmate and left her hair natural, twisted up at the crown, a few coils loose around her face because she didn't have the tools or the time to do anything more elaborate. She had no idea how she looked. She had no frame of reference for it. She just knew that for one evening, she felt less invisible than usual, and she was trying to hold that feeling gently, without gripping it too hard. She found Adaeze near the 3rd table, and something shifted almost immediately in Adeze's expression. Something that moved through her eyes too quickly to be read, there and gone before Chisom could process it. Then the wide smile, the embrace, the arm linked through hers as she introduced her to the circle of women who looked Chisom up and down with expressions carefully assembled to look welcoming. For the first 20 minutes, Chisom was fine. More than fine. She spoke to a Ghanaian diplomat's wife who asked about her research with genuine curiosity. She managed a brief, warm exchange with an elderly Korean professor who complimented her English and asked where she had studied. She stood near the window and looked out at Seoul's night skyline and let herself feel, just briefly, like maybe she had earned the right to be somewhere beautiful. That was when she began to notice people noticing her. Not in the hostile way she'd braced for. In the way people notice when something catches the light correctly. A quiet appreciation, a second glance, the small social signal of a room acknowledging that someone deserves its attention. An event photographer drifted in her direction twice. A Korean actress whose face Chisom half recognized from a drama her classmate used to watch said something to her companion and nodded in Chisom's direction with what looked like approval. It was gentle and entirely unintentional, and it lasted less than 30 minutes. But it was enough. Adaeze had seen it. Adaeze had watched the photographer, had watched the actress, had watched 3 different men in suits pause their conversations to track Chisom's path across the room. And something behind Adeze's eyes had turned from calculation to something older and uglier. She pulled her phone from her clutch and sent a single message to the group chat. Now, the security guard appeared first. He came through the crowd with the quiet authority of someone who had been briefed, stopping a few feet from Chisom and asking, in Korean, if she was the guest of Mrs. Kwon. Chisom turned, confused, feeling the first trickle of cold premonition. Before she could answer fully, Adaeze was beside her, and her face had changed completely. Gone was the warmth. Gone was the arm-linking and the smile. In its place was something theatrical and cold, the expression of a woman preparing to perform grief in front of an audience. "That's my dress," she said, loudly, not to Chisom, to the room. The string quartet didn't stop immediately. The conversations around them dimmed in waves, table by table, as people turned to locate the source of the disruption. And then Adeze's voice rose further, cracking with manufactured emotion. "She went through my wardrobe and she took it. I've been looking for it for weeks." She pressed a hand to her mouth. Her friends materialized at her sides, already consoling her, already turning outraged faces toward Chisom. Chisom's mind went completely blank. "Adaeze," she started. "Don't." Adeeze's voice dropped into something sharp and quiet and precise, and somehow that was worse than the theatrics. "You always wanted what I had. Everyone back home knew it. I felt sorry for you, and look what you do." The cameras were already out. Chisom could see the phones rising around the perimeter of the gathering crowd. Guests who had come for charity and were now recording a different kind of entertainment. She could hear the whispers spreading, could feel the weight of collective judgment settling over her like something physical, something she had to stand under. One of Adaeze's friends, the one Chisom would later learn was named Yoonji, said something in Korean that drew laughter from a cluster of guests nearby. Chisom didn't catch all of it, but she caught enough. Something about knowing your place. Something about African girls who didn't understand that attending a gala wasn't the same as belonging at one. And then the wine. She didn't see it coming. One moment she was standing, trembling, trying to hold her posture and failing. And then the cold red liquid hit the front of her dress with the particular violence of something meant to land exactly where it did. Not spilled, not accidental, deliberate, aimed. Minji stood there with a half-empty glass and an expression of exaggerated apology that fooled no one who was paying real attention. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Some people gasped. Some people laughed. Phones rose higher. Someone near the back said something that got a response, and the response got a louder response, and the whole thing was building toward a kind of roar that Chisom could feel in her chest before she could hear it in the room. She didn't cry. She wanted to. She was going to later in the car in ways she hadn't cried in years. But standing there, she was too overtaken by a kind of hollow, echoing disbelief. Not that people could be cruel, she knew that, but that someone who shared her blood, who had called her on a Thursday evening and asked about her mother, who had wrapped a dress in tissue and sent it across the city to her door, that this was what it had been building toward. The security team was requesting she come with them. The voices around her were getting louder. She was about to comply because what else do you do? What other tool does a person without power or platform or money have in a room full of people who have all of those things? When something changed, a silence moved through the crowd. Not the silence of shock. A different kind. The silence of a room realizing that its center of gravity had shifted. Park Jiwon had stood up from his table. "Before we get to the CEO's investigation, are you still here? Because I need you to be here for this next part. This is where everything turns. This is the moment that changes everything for everyone in that room." If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story about justice done right. Park Jiwon had not built one of South Korea's most respected holding companies by being loud. He was, by every account of people who had worked with him or opposed him in business, a man of extraordinary patience. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions that seemed mild and revealed themselves later to be surgical. He had a habit, noted by multiple former employees in profile pieces, of going very, very still when something important was happening, as if noise itself was a distraction from the information that mattered. He had gone very, very still approximately 4 minutes before Adaeze said, "That's my dress." He had noticed the security guard being positioned before the scene began. He had noticed Adaeze's phone in her hand, noticed the message she sent, noticed the speed with which her friends converged on a situation that should have surprised them. He had noticed the event photographer, his own hired photographer, moving to capture the interaction from an angle that suggested prior instruction. He had been at enough corporate presentations to recognize a coordinated rollout. He left his table quietly. He spoke to his head of event security for 45 seconds. Then he walked to the main control room that all events of this size maintain, the room with the CCTV feeds, the communication logs, the complete electronic record of the evening, and he sat down. What he found in the next 12 minutes changed the nature of the evening completely. The CCTV footage from the venue's backstage area showed Adaeze, 2 hours before the gala began, examining the dress with the event coordinator and pointing to specific angles. The audio was partial but sufficient. Then it showed Minji refilling her wine glass at a service station, exchanging a look with Yoonji, positioning herself. The event security coordinator, faced with Park Jiwon asking questions in the particular tone that made clear the consequences of lying significantly outweighed the consequences of honesty. Produced his communication log for the evening. He had received instructions from a Kwon Sungo family employee to position staff near table 7 before 9 p.m. No reason specified. One of Park Jiwon's personal assistants, working in the adjacent room, had already begun pulling the social media activity of the 4 women involved. The drafted caption posts, prepared before the event, timestamped, were found in Yoonji's public drafts folder, visible to anyone who looked for them. 3 versions. Backup plans for backup plans. Park Jiwon read all of it and felt a particular kind of cold clarity that he associated with moments when something he'd suspected became something he knew. But it was the second layer that was darker. His financial compliance officer, whom he called at 9:47 p.m. and who arrived at the venue within 20 minutes because Park Jiwon's calls were the kind people came to immediately, had been sitting on a referral for 6 weeks. A referral from an internal audit of a Kwon Sungo subsidiary that shared a development project with one of PJ Holdings' community investment arms. Missing funds. A redirected transfer. An account that led, after 2 degrees of separation, to a personal account registered under Adaeze Kwon's maiden name. The compliance officer had flagged it as requiring further investigation. Standing in the control room of his own charity gala, Park Jiwon understood, fully and completely, why tonight's scene had been staged with such precision. The embezzlement investigation was building. Someone on the inside had told Adaeze that it was building. And a spectacular, shareable public scandal about a Nigerian girl stealing a dress at a charity gala was meant to fill the news cycle, to set the narrative, to give gossip blogs and social media commenters something else to chew on. She had tried to use his event, his charity, his name on the banner. He stood up and spoke 2 sentences to the control room operator. Then he walked back into the ballroom. The projector screens used for the gala's charity presentations, the large, high-definition screens positioned so every person in the room could see them, flickered to life. The ballroom went absolutely silent. On the screens, in clear high definition, the CCTV footage from backstage played. Adaeze pointing, the coordinator nodding, Minji at the service station, the time-stamped draft posts, the audio from the backstage conversation, partial but damning, transcribed in Korean and English at the bottom of the screen for the international guests. Then the financial documents, account transfers, redirected funds, a name. 300 people watched in complete silence. Adeze's face did something that was almost painful to observe. It moved through 4 or 5 distinct expressions in rapid succession before settling into a blankness that was worse than any of them. Her friends had gone rigid beside her. Yoonji had her hand over her mouth, and it wasn't theatrical this time. Minji had stepped backward twice, as if distance from the screen would help. Someone had begun recording. Then someone else. Then almost everyone. Park Jiwon walked to the center of the room, near the podium, and he looked at Chisom first, who was standing in her wine-stained dress, stunned into stillness, not understanding yet what she was watching. And then he addressed the room with the controlled, precise authority of a man who had rehearsed nothing and needed nothing. "This young woman," he said, indicating Chisom, "is a guest of this event. She will continue to be treated as one. Any further disruption directed at her will be addressed as a legal matter." He paused. "The other matter you have just seen will be addressed in its entirety, by the appropriate institutions." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The room understood. The world Adaeze had built did not collapse all at once. It came apart in sections the way expensive things do, expensively with a great deal of noise. The videos from the gala were online within an hour. Not the videos Minji had planned to post, the ones showing Chisom being humiliated. The other videos. The ones showing Adeze's face on the projector screen, the CCTV footage, the draft social media captions with their timestamps. The ones showing a woman who had planned a public destruction of her own cousin to distract from the money she had helped steal. By morning, Adeze's name was the top trending topic on Korean social media. By afternoon, Nigerian entertainment news had picked it up, and then the Nigerian diaspora community online, and then international African media, and then the kind of mid-tier global news aggregators that feed celebrity gossip into the international news stream, and suddenly this was not a Seoul story. This was everywhere. Kwon Sung-go's family's lawyers moved quickly enough to confirm, to anyone watching, that they had something to protect. But law firms can slow things down. They cannot stop them entirely. The Financial Oversight Committee that had been quietly investigating the subsidiary irregularities was no longer quiet. They were very, very loud, with the specific authority of institutions that have been waiting for the political moment to act and find it has finally arrived. Sung-go filed for legal separation within 2 weeks. Whether this was to protect his family's assets from what was coming, or whether it was genuine or both, was something that the gossip accounts debated endlessly without resolution. But the paperwork was filed. The marriage that Adaeze had worn like a trophy for 6 years was over. The 3 women, Yoonji, Minji, and the third friend who had mostly stayed silent but whose messages appeared in the group chat that was eventually subpoenaed, faced varying degrees of consequence. Yoonji's husband, a mid-level executive at a Korean entertainment company, quietly asked her to move out while his company conducted its own internal review of her association with the Kwon financial scandal. Minji's sponsorship deal with a skincare brand, the one she'd been cultivating for 2 years, was terminated via email with language so clinical it must have felt like a paper cut that kept going. Adaeze was formally arrested for questioning 7 weeks after the gala. It took 7 weeks because arrests involving financial crimes of this complexity require 7 weeks of building the case correctly. And then the case was built, and the handcuffs were real, and the photographs taken outside the police station in Gangnam were real, and they circulated the internet with the ruthless efficiency of images that people share not for information but for something darker and more satisfying. Her Gangnam apartment was vacated by month's end. Her cousin told a Korean news outlet she'd had no idea about the financial irregularities, a claim that investigators were still examining when the reports went to print. Her Instagram, which had once catalogued the lunch restaurants and the Bali sunsets and the charity galas in loving, meticulous detail, was set to private and then deleted entirely. The social circle dissolved. This is what always happens with circles built around image rather than loyalty. When the image cracks, there is nothing underneath to hold people together. The women who had attended every dinner, liked every post, attended every event, disappeared with the efficiency of people who had always known, on some level, that proximity to the wrong person was a liability they were one scandal away from paying for. And Chisom had stood in that ballroom in a wine-stained dress and watched a world she had never been part of tear itself apart. She had not felt triumphant. She had not felt satisfied. She felt something much quieter and much harder to name, the particular emotional exhaustion of a person who has survived something they should never have been subjected to in the first place. Park Jiwon crossed the room to her before the evening was over. He spoke to her briefly, directly, without the patronizing softness that people sometimes use when they believe they are rescuing someone. He told her what he had found. He told her she owed no one in that room an explanation or an apology. He told her that she had conducted herself with more dignity than anyone present deserved to witness. And then he said the sentence that people would later clip from the event footage and share across the internet in the weeks that followed. Anyone who has to destroy someone else to feel powerful has already told you everything you need to know about them. He said it simply, without anger, without performance. And somehow that was what made it unforgettable. She got home at 1:30 in the morning. She took off the dress. Carefully, slowly, the way you handle something that has been through something, and she folded it and set it on her small desk. The wine stain had set. It wasn't coming out. But she folded it anyway, precisely, out of some instinct she couldn't explain. Maybe because it had cost more than her rent and deserved the respect of being folded. Maybe because folding it gave her hands something to do. Then she sat on the edge of her bed in the small, quiet apartment in Mapogu, with its single window that looked out at other apartment windows, and the mop in the corner from her last cleaning shift, and the textbooks piled on her desk with their sticky note tabs, and the photograph of her mother tacked above her study space, and she cried. She cried the way she never let herself cry in public. Openly, completely, with nothing managed or controlled about it, the sound coming from somewhere deep and old, from the place inside a person where all the unshed grief accumulates over years of deciding to be strong. She cried for the loneliness, for the Thursday phone call that had felt like someone finally seeing her, for the dress in the tissue paper and what she had allowed herself to feel when she unwrapped it, for all the small, careful dreams she had been protecting for 3 years that had briefly, for one evening, felt like they might be allowed to breathe. She cried until she didn't anymore. And then she sat in the quiet and she thought about a man standing in a ballroom who had seen something wrong and decided that his power was not for decoration. Who had used it the way it should be used, to correct, to protect, to restore something that should never have been taken. She had never had that. Not once. Not from any institution, any authority, any person with more power than herself. She had learned, slowly and pragmatically, that in most rooms, she was invisible. And she had learned to survive that invisibility by becoming very good at not needing what wasn't being offered. Somebody had seen her. Not as a story, not as a cause, not as an example of anything. Just as a person who deserved dignity. She didn't sleep for a long time that night, but the quality of her wakefulness was different from the kind she was used to. Not the alert, anxious wakefulness of someone counting hours until the alarm, but something more like the stillness after a storm. The email from PJ Holdings University liaison arrived 3 days later. A full scholarship offer with stipend for the remaining 2 years of her degree, renewable upon academic completion. Attached was a separate letter from Park Jiwon, brief and professional, noting that the company ran an environmental sustainability research division that had been looking to expand its international graduate internship program, and that her academic profile had been reviewed with interest. She read both letters twice. Then she sat very still for a long time. Then she called her mother. She didn't explain everything on that call. There would be time for that later, slowly. She just said, "Something happened, Mama. Something happened and I'm okay. Actually, I think I'm going to be okay." And her mother, who had spent 3 years not saying how frightened she was, how she prayed over that single photograph in the kitchen every morning, how she sometimes woke at night and just said Chisom's name into the dark. Her mother just breathed, long and slow, and said, "I know, my daughter. I know. Thank you so much for staying with this story until the very end. Truly, if you're still here, you are exactly the kind of person these stories are made for. You understand that stories like Chisom's are not just entertainment. They are mirrors. They are warnings. They are sometimes the thing that reminds us that grace under pressure is not weakness. It is one of the rarest and most powerful things a human being can carry. What happened to Chisom happens in different rooms, at different scales, all over the world. People are targeted not because of what they've done wrong, but because of what they represent to someone too small to celebrate someone else's existence without feeling diminished by it. Jealousy is one of the most destructive forces on earth, and it is most dangerous when it wears the face of family. I want to ask you something before you go, and please answer honestly in the comments. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your vulnerability? Someone who saw your need and used it as a weapon? And do you believe that people like Adaeze ever truly understand the damage they cause? Or does the downfall always surprise them? Drop your thoughts below. This comment section is always a real conversation, and I read them. If the story moved you, please like this video. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't, because every week we bring you stories of resilience, justice, and the quiet power of people who refuse to be broken. And share this one. Share it for every Chisom you know. Share it for everyone who has ever stood in a room where they were meant to feel small and found, somehow, a way to remain whole. The world needs more Park Jiwons. But more than that, it needs more Chisoms. People who carry their dreams carefully through difficult seasons, who do not let hardship make them hard, who remain, against all reasonable odds, kind. Stay with us. The next story is already coming.